So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the conference organisers and particularly to CRIMT for the funding support that was provided that allowed me to physically be here and have this amazing experience beyond just presenting my work. I'd also like to acknowledge my amazing supervisors, the three. It takes three to wrangle me, apparently. I won't go through this, but yes, I'm very lucky with my supervision team. So before I start, I'd just like to sort of just introduce a little bit about myself and where I'm from, and some of this, Karen can borrow this because we're very similar in our background in some senses. So I would like to acknowledge the First Nations people here in Canada, and I would normally acknowledge, if I was in Australia, the First Nations people of Australia, but First Nations people everywhere as well. And this map shows the 250 Indigenous language groups that exist within Australia. So the place where I live currently is where my research is being conducted is in Naarm or Melbourne, and which is located on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people in the southeast of Australia. And you can see that on the right hand list at the like. But in terms of my birthplace and where my birth family lives, this is way across the other side of the country on the unceded lands of the Wajunk people in the southeast of Western Australia. So that just sort of gives you some perspective of, you know, what we're trying to do in terms of acknowledging our history in Australia and trying to make some advances that recognises that there were people before white settlement in Australia, and to acknowledge that the land that we normally are working on is unceded and was never given up. I come to this work as an experienced unionist, but as a novice researcher. And so I'm hoping then that's the hint for you to all be gentle in the way that you treat this. So you have to be nice. There you go. So today I'll present some of my findings from my doctoral research, which is examining new regulatory approaches beyond the current anti-discrimination approach, and looking at what may better support the prevention of gender-based violence at work in Australia. And the focus of this paper today is on an analysis of submissions made to the recent national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces by organisations who are pressing for regulatory change in this area. So in Australia, sexual harassment at work is unlawful, and yet it persists. Regulators, practitioners and scholars acknowledge that the current dominant anti-discrimination approach, which represents the problem of sexual harassment as one of individual rights and inequality, is not fit for the purpose of preventing sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence at work. So what is the alternative? So my research is a feminist socio-legal study of contemporary developments in the regulation of gender-based violence and harassment at work. And in my research, I draw on relational gender theories where gender-based violence and harassment is conceptualised as one means by which the patriarchal gender order in society and at work is maintained. Work is seen as a key location where patriarchy and the dominant forms of masculinity prevalent in Western neoliberal economies and societies are reinforced and reproduced. And in this inquiry, therefore, I explore the extent to which any new approaches comprehend the systematic nature of the dimensions of gender and gender power relationships at work. So I take in my research a decentered approach to regulation, where regulation, and I've adopted Julia Black's definition of regulation, which emphasises that regulation is deliberative and purpose-driven. Regulation, in my definition, occurs through a variety of mechanisms, techniques, or instruments, and is undertaken by and within a regulating community, which includes various tribunals, regulatory agencies, but also the actors such as employers, unions, and civil society bodies that engage with work and work-related matters. So there are three contemporary developments investigated in my overall inquiry. They include the recent ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment in the World of Work, as I've said, the Human Rights Commission National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces, which I'll focus on today, and the evolution of a work health and safety approach, which has been driven by the union movement being implemented in one state, in Victoria, in Australia. So in terms of my presentation today, the question that I'm exploring is how different representations of the problem of sexual harassment and gender-based violence impact regulatory reforms designed to prevent it, and what are the implications for future regulation that flow from that problem representation. And so to do that, I've conducted an analysis of the submissions of members of the regulating community, which gives insights into both how, so submissions to the National Inquiry, which give insights into both how they see the problem and what flows from that in terms of regulatory innovation. So just as a bit of background about the National Inquiry, in 2018 and 2019, the Australian Human Rights Commission conducted a national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. The National Inquiry was established to coincide with the public release of results of the 4th National Survey into sexual harassment in Australia. And the results from this survey documented the extent and prevalence of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. The evidence of the prevalence of sexual harassment in Australian workplaces was not new. In each of the 3 preceding national surveys, the prevalence of sexual harassment was documented and was similar to what the 4th survey showed. So the question becomes, why was therefore out of the 4th an inquiry at this time? And so the decision to conduct an inquiry, or I argue the decision to conduct the inquiry in 2018 can be attributed to the significant public and political pressure for action on sexual harassment at work driven by global and local factors. And those global factors include the Me Too movement, but also the ITUC's push for the ILO Convention, and also a number of domestic scandals, which I think in other countries have been the same, in universities, defence forces, police, courts, but also union activism in the area and advocacy from the violence against women sector. So in terms of my approach or methods for this investigation, I've used Barchi's What's the Problem Represented to Be approach to policy analysis, which investigates what flows from the different social and political representations of social problems, and critical frame analysis, which I use to create a framework to analyse the submissions. And the contents from the organisational submissions that were publicly available were investigated. That's 135 submissions, and they were coded deductively using this framework based on the questions that you can see now on the PowerPoint slide. So I've identified, through this analysis, I have identified 4 main representations of the problem of sexual harassment, which I'm suggesting could form a typology of approaches. And I'd be interested to see if your feedback, if we get the time, about whether this resonates with your experience as well, or whether you think this typology is actually useful. And I'll take the opportunity now to take you briefly through each of the representations. So frame 1, which is the violence against women frame, represents the problem of sexual harassment as a form of gendered violence against women, or gender-based violence with significant impacts on health and well-being. The sexual harassment is seen as a social problem in work and elsewhere that is part of a broader phenomenon of gendered violence. Here, the models for analysis and theory of change stem from public health approaches to violence against women. Gender equality in this approach is seen as setting the condition, gender inequality is seen as setting the conditions for violence against women. Therefore, strategies to promote gender equality or address gender inequality are central to preventing violence against women, including sexual harassment. These models are being used within Australia to address interpersonal violence, such as family or domestic violence. An assumption or presumption underpinning this approach is that the public health primary prevention models used for family and domestic violence will be effective in addressing sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence at work. In this approach, the workplace is a social setting like many others, including sporting clubs, schools, and the media, where prevention against violence from women work can be undertaken. So the work is a location where prevention work can be undertaken in this approach. Another assumption that is made is that those engaged in prevention of violence against women work using this public health model will be well placed to undertake advisory work looking at changes within the workplace. The regulatory tools identified include soft regulatory approaches such as behavioural insight strategies, bystander awareness training, the utilisation in some instances of what are called equality or respect standards, and whole of population media, sort of public media campaigns for gender equality and against violence. There are two issues that are left unproblematic or unresolved in this representation of the problem. The first stems from the settings-based model, which assumes that work is a social setting like others, and that the assumption that public health models will be effective in making changes within these institutions of work. I see some of your faces on that one. The design of work-based strategies by organisations unfamiliar with the dynamics and institutions of work may, I propose, limit the effectiveness of the approach. And the second issue that's left unproblematic or unresolved is the motivation of employers. This approach requires a commitment to gender equality and desire by organisations to address it. And the soft tools proposed are at the employer's discretion, so they're voluntary uptake. And it's difficult for me to see how that can be a mechanism for change across the labour market, particularly in workplaces where the employer may not be so progressive. So the second frame that I identified in the submissions was from employer associations, and it's noteworthy that there were no public submissions from any employers other than the 4 peak employer associations in Australia. In this representation, sexual harassment is seen primarily as a problem of interpersonal conflict and ingrained attitudes that are generated as societal problems are imported or brought into the workplace from outside. The problem is seen as one of individuals behaving badly and as an individual problem for the individual victim also. There is support for the there is support in this approach, therefore, from the employer associations for the current regulatory regime through anti-discrimination jurisdictions which rely on the individual complaints-based type, confidential individual complaints-based process. And they oppose any mechanisms that would allow for collective claims or disputes on sexual harassment, including the provision of clauses within enterprise agreements or collective agreements around sexual harassment. What is left unproblematic or unresolved in this representation of the problem is the extent to which meso-level gender regimes within the institution of work or across the labour market or in organisations themselves and the micro-level cultures and practices within organisations create the environment for sexual harassment and injure those who experience it. Submissions by the major peak employer bodies also pay little attention to the issue of complaints handling and their poor complaints handling, the role of impacts of bystanders, or how the organisation and conditions of work that the organisation employs create the conditions for violence. There is no attention to the issue of third-party violence in their approach, and in this problem representation of the or theory of change is based on the removal of the problem from the workplace. So the responsibility of the employer rests in removing individuals who perpetrate the violence, and therefore their calls for easier unfair dismissal laws or to free up the unfair dismissal laws to more easily get rid of people is their major strategy. In the third frame, this representation is put forward by specialist work health and safety organisations and experts, and aspects of this framing are also contained in the fourth frame that I'll talk about. In this representation of the problem, sexual harassment is an issue of workplace health and safety. The focus is on the provision of a safe system of work. Tools proposed for responding to this problem include utilising regulations and guidance material on psychosocial hazards in the workplace and international standards around the management of health and safety work systems. What's left unproblematic or unresolved in this representation is the historical approach to workplace health and safety regulation, which has emphasised physical injury and has effectively ignored issues such as sexual harassment as a work health and safety problem. Although that's starting to change, at least within Australia. What is also left unproblematic is the capacity of regulators to regulate issues of sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence. The regulation of psychosocial hazards is relatively new to work health and safety regulators in Australia, and there is the potential for work health and safety regulators to concentrate only on the behavioural aspects to addressing sexual harassment, rather than taking a broad systems-based approach, which they would normally do with physical injuries. A further limitation is the extent to which basically all work health and safety regulators have a gender-neutral approach to work health and safety. So I've got to come up with a better name for this one. So if there's any ideas, you can talk to me afterwards because it's too much of a mouthful. But the fourth frame looks at the issue of violence, sexual harassment as a problem in society and work with causes and consequences in both. In this frame, a similar representation of the problem that is contained in frame one is adopted. However, more attention is given to the institutions of work and their role in prevention and response. This representation of the problem sees sexual harassment as a cultural, systemic, and health and safety issue, and it's present in a number of the organisational submissions from legal organisations, unions, and as well as some academics. In this frame, specific attention is paid to the importance of the problem as one beyond individual behaviour and to focus on both prevention and response. And the primary duty to prevent sexual harassment that occurs at work or is associated with work should be placed on employers in this frame. And the articulation of new rights, particularly those under work health and safety and labour law, is prominent in the proposals that are there, including using labour rights tribunals as opposed to anti-discrimination tribunals to deal with the issue of sexual harassment. New labour rights to be enlivened include the introduction of standard clauses in enterprise agreements, the focus on prevention and response measures, the right of entry of union officials to inspect in relation to sexual harassment matters. These are all advocated. There are also, the desire to enliven dormant rights, including having workplace health and safety regulators take more action in this space. What is left unproblematic or unresolved in this representation of the problem is a coherent theory of change and the lack of clarity regarding where responsibility for dealing with the issue would actually rest, particularly amongst regulators. Without a sense of how to integrate the regulatory reform proposals effectively, a potential barrier therefore is to the effectiveness of this approach is the regulatory overlap and the potential for confusion. And I would say, and I was trying overnight to think of an appropriate word, but I would say the duck shoving amongst regulators. And what I mean by that is the regulators saying it's not our responsibility, it's your responsibility, and sort of pushing it around, therefore nothing gets done. So one of the difficulties, of course, is that's the approach that was adopted by the recommendations from the National Inquiry. So in appeasing everyone, the author of the report from the Human Rights Commission said, yeah, I'll have all of it, thanks very much, and put that forward. And that's what we've ended up with now, is this kind of hodgepodge, approach. So therefore, in terms of my conclusions around all of that, I would say there is an active regulating community which is seeking to address the phenomenon of sexual harassment at work. And that's the first thing. But the second thing is that what's the problem represented to be approach has been a useful tool in digging deeper into the differences between those advocating for change. There is some overlap and complementarity, say that on a Friday afternoon, in the different way that the problem is represented between frames 1, 3, and 4, between the violence against women frame, the work health and safety frame, and the union sort of legal frame. not all representations of the problem comprehend both the societal and the work-related aspects of gender-based violence, or the dimensions of gender and work as institutions. Those who are working in frames 1, 3, and 4 would benefit from a greater collaboration to achieve a more comprehensive and cohesive representation of the problem and a theory or theories of change that might deal more effectively with the dynamics of both gender and work. The representation of the problem by peak employer bodies is concerning. The voice of peak employer bodies is highly influential, even though we've had a change of government in Australia. And the first regulatory innovations that were adopted out of the recommendations from the National Inquiry were those that were called for from the employers to make it easier to sack people who are seen to be harassers. So that tells you where some of the priorities sort of sit. The violence against women representation reflects the current approach addressing violence against women in Australia more generally, and it's highly influential and has been generated largely by organisations with limited experience with the dynamics of work, and they're getting lots of funding for this work. And the limitations of this approach pointed out in my analysis need to be addressed if this is going to continue, if they're going to be seen as a priority space for doing prevention work in organisations. And the frame 4, or the multidimensional, or better named, approach may at first seem to be the most comprehensive, but it doesn't comprehend the dimensions, because it does comprehend the dimensions of gender and work. However, the lack of cohesive theory of change could lead to a scattergun of initiatives, as I've suggested. So that's where I've kind of ended in that part of the analysis, and I take that up in the rest of my thesis. And so that's just, you have to wait for the next CRIMP conference. Thank you very much.